Today's day 6, different kind of dictator. Day 6 is about Hideki Tojo, totalitarian leader. Question for today: to what extent was Hideki Tojo, as terrible as the other totalitarian leaders of this time? We're comparing him against, there we go. We're comparing him against Stalin, Mussolini, and Hitler. Here's our chart of political spectrum that we've been using to talk about these different leaders. So, to what extent was this guy as bad as all of those guys? All right. So, what was happening in Japan that made people listen to Tojo in the 1920s and 30s? Between 1890 and 1920, Japan was in a Europeanizing cultural moment. They were Europeanizing their culture, they were Europeanizing their clothing and lifestyle, but also, more importantly, industrialization, factories, and also adopting sort of European style imperialism, taking over Korea, for example, and an increasing desire to make an empire in Asia, similar to that the Europeans had. Young Hideki Tojo, here he is in his military uniform, went to Germany to learn how the German military did its stuff. He learned how the Prussian military was so effective, how they organized things, and how like a modern European army operated. And also, post World War I, there was a movement to modernize, women's clothing. For example, here we have the idea of modern girls. There was a movement away from traditionalism and towards sort of modernity. But this all fell apart because of the economic collapse, the Great Depression that happened across the world. It's called the Great Depression for a reason. It didn't just happen in one country. Starting in the US, yes, but expanding to eventually the rest of the world. For example, to review, Germany owed money to France because of the Treaty of Versailles. Germany borrowed money from the US to pay France. The US economy crashed when the stock market collapsed in 1929. The US banks asked the German banks to pay their loans back. That meant Germany stopped paying France, which meant that Germany and France stopped buying products from other places. Combine this with the fact that Russia, Soviet Union has exited the economy of the world, and you have a collapse across all of the countries that would be connected. Like if Japan previously sold things to Germany or to France or to the US, and those economies collapsed, Japan would not be able to sell things to those places, and those places would not be able to buy things from Japan. So here you have the aftermath of a protest about the economic collapse, just to kind of give you a sense that people decided liberalism and Europeanization was the problem. People decided we need to go back to traditional Japanese values. And so these two images here are to remind us of the movement away from European modern style clothing, industrial style clothing, all of those things, and a return to traditionalism. Tojo wanted to revive traditional militarism, revive like the samurai sort of tradition of warriorness, but also keep modern weapons. So let's move our culture back, but keep some of the modern conveniences and technology. Number 2. Tojo was coming to power. He was rising through the ranks in the military. How did he blame the problems of Japan on some other groups in order to gain power for himself? A couple of different things. One, we already talked about modernism, modern culture, women in pants, European stuff infiltrating Japanese society. He thought that was a problem, and he was able to sort of scapegoat that to the Japanese public. The second problem was European colonies in Asia. You have this map here, which shows all of the different European nations that controlled chunks of Asia. Tojo and some other people believed that those places should rightfully be owned by Japan. Japan should have a bigger empire. Japan should not just control Korea and Formosa and some little islands. It should instead control some of these other places, like maybe French or German, sorry, not German, French, British, US colonies, maybe kick out the Dutch from Indonesia, something like that. The third problem is that inside Japanese politics, there were two factions. There were two parties or two groups. One group thought that they should mostly focus on the Soviet Union. They were known as Kodoha, and that means imperial way. And they thought they should continue to focus on the Soviet Union, continue to fight wars against the Soviet Union for territory in the northwest, continuing sort of the Russo-Japanese War of 1905 into the 20th century. The other group, Toseiha, thought that Japan's best bet was to focus on China and taking over colonies to the south. Toseiha means control group, and this was the group that Tojo favored. So, through a lot of complicated political and violent maneuvering, Tojo and the Toseiha came to power in Japan. Tojo, as a military leader, used the Kempeitai, the military police, to terrorize, torture, interrogate, imprison any opposition. So members of the Kodoha might be imprisoned, interrogated, tortured until they either disappear or quiet down their opposition. We don't have any good pictures to illustrate that. That's why I have this sort of interrogator's lamp image. It's a very dark, terrifying thing where the Kempeitai capture the opposition, they imprison people, they torture people, and it's a reign of terror. So that you want to think similar to the SS in Germany, similar to the NKVD in the Soviet Union, secret sort of military police, the black shirts in Italy, very partisan and terrorizing way to silence the opposition. Number 3, what did General Tojo promise that appealed to people? Oh, my thing blocks here. Well, it says tripartite agreement. So one of the things is this tripartite agreement with Germany and with Italy. So promising that Japan would become a fascist, imperialist state along the lines of Germany and Italy. Similar to Italy, when they conquered Ethiopia, Japan wanted to make an empire and conquer inferior peoples. Similar to Germany and its idea of Lebensraum, conquering land for the racially superior Japanese to take land away from the racially inferior other people. Similar to Hitler and Mussolini, it's a little bit more than just racism. This is sort of eugenics-based nationalism. Eugenics meaning sort of fake science, fake use of genetics to conflate, to combine like physical appearance with intelligence or bravery or some of these less hereditary traits. So in the case of Germany, we already talked about like maybe, equating eye color to intelligence. In the case of Japan, Japanese racial identity was eugenically associated with superior humanity. Japanese people were good people, were real people, and everyone else were not human. Okay. So this brings us to these pictures. Japan's empire that Tojo was promising was to expand not just from this little islands here into Korea, but also into Manchuria and then China, and then eventually all of these areas down here and out here in the Pacific Ocean. The Toseiha faction was ascendant. They were taking control. They were rising. And Tojo promised to use that idea, that focus on China, to obtain tons and tons of resources, farmland, and other things that China had that they wanted. A lot of farmland. These pictures, this piece of propaganda at the bottom it features a happy Japanese farmer on his new land in Manchuria or in China or somewhere like that in the empire. The pictures up here in the middle of the Nanking Massacre are part of this promise. Inside the promise to take over more land is the promise to clear out the people who were there. If Japan needs more land, they need to get rid of the people who are on that land. And so in the case of China, in the invasion of China, which has subsequently been called the Nanking Massacre or the Rape of Nanking, It was inspired by German and Italian invasions of quite similar type, but potentially even more violent. Japanese soldiers would go into regions of China and just clear out the people who were there. The Chinese or other inferior people were cleared out, massacred in large numbers, decapitated, all of the different ways that you can think of, buried alive, tortured, and rape. The systematic rape and torture of tens of thousands of Chinese women is one of the darkest legacies of the Japanese Empire. I have these two pictures here to illustrate this. These are some of the least gory pictures that I could find, but this is a pile of dead bodies. I picked this picture because there are, chopped lumber back here and dead people up here, kind of nonchalantly observed by this Japanese soldier. And then this is also decapitated Chinese, I think men, maybe women, I don't know, decapitated heads. It's unknown how many people were killed in the Nanking massacre, the rape of Nanking, but in a 6-week period, anywhere from 300,000 to up to 20 million people were killed. This brings us to question 4. Kind of once Tojo comes to power and the invasion of China has begun or has continued, how did Tojo manipulate the thoughts and actions of the people? How did Tojo and his followers convince soldiers to rape and murder people indiscriminately? How did they convince people to believe in the eugenics of Japanese racial superiority? So Tojo manipulated Japan by sort of exaggerating history, quite similar to Mussolini's appeal to the Italians as Romans, quite similar to Hitler's appeal to Germans as the inheritors of the Second Reich and the First Reich, sort of going back to history. Tojo does the same thing. And he invokes, the samurai tradition of Bushido. Samurai were a real part of Japanese history. Colorized photo here, painting here, or woodblock here. Samurai had a tradition of a code of behavior called Bushido. There's a lot we could say about this, but we'll stick to the quickest way to explain it. Basically, Bushido is a code of behavior. It's a code of honor for samurai warriors, which includes lots of things, but most importantly, the idea that you never surrender. You win or die. You win or die trying. And if you get captured or if you lose and you didn't get killed, you are expected to commit ritual suicide if you're one of these samurai warriors. And so seppuku, here in this illustration, is that ritual suicide. You're supposed to stab yourself with your own sword and disembowel your guts. It's literally a history of a culture of death before dishonor. You're either dead or the winner. Historically, that applied to just the samurai, the specialized warrior class, but Tojo manipulates the people of Japan into thinking they are all samurai. Everyone in Japan, all Japanese soldiers, and eventually all Japanese people have to follow this samurai code of Bushido. This means that thereafter, anybody who surrenders in a fight is weak and has lost their rights as a human. This means that anybody who's taken prisoner should be executed or can be tortured or has simply lost all of their rights as a human. You have the decapitation of potentially hundreds of thousands of Chinese prisoners, civilians who surrender, men, women, children, doesn't matter. Under the code of Bushido, if you surrender, you've lost your rights as a human. This idea of convincing the whole population to follow Bushido has to start from a young age. So there's a concerted effort to militarize children, even in elementary school, and to brainwash them from a young age into believing in this code of behavior and this idea of death before dishonor, so that by the time you get to the 1940s, most of the Japanese population is convinced that they are the inheritors of the samurai tradition and that they should fight to the death to defend their people. This brings us to Unit 731. This is the picture I've chosen for that. Anyone who questions any of these things, anyone who questions the idea of Bushido or the militarization of civilians, could be captured, arrested, and sent to Unit 731 by the Kempeitai. Remember the military police, the Kempeitai capture and torture people. Later on, they create Unit 731, which is the code name, which is also sometimes codenamed the Human Biological Experiment. Or sorry, it's not the code name. It's a place for human biological experimentation. The code name is the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. So epidemic prevention, meaning that they are going to test biological weapons on prisoners there in order to create vaccines for the Japanese population, to create biological weapons and then vaccines for the Japanese people. And then the plan would be to drop those biological weapons on China or the US or any other enemy. Unit 731 is legendary for its horrible human experimentation on prisoners, experiments into the nature of frostbite. People were frozen alive and then revived. Vivisections, meaning dissecting people while they're still alive with no anesthetic, with no painkillers. Deliberate infections of people with diseases to see what happens. Experimentation with plague, with anthrax, with all kinds of poisons and diseases. And it's a top secret program. Humans who were brought there were codenamed or spoken about in code as if they were logs. So how many logs were transported, how many logs fell, as in how many humans were killed. And it was top secret. So top secret and so encoded, so secret that a lot of people didn't even know it was happening. The results of the medical experiments done in Unit 731 were often published in medical journals. However, it was claimed that the experiments were done on Manchurian monkeys, not humans. A lot of those medical experiments and those results contributed quite a bit to medical science and scientific knowledge, but it's one of the darkest things of the Japanese Empire. So back to our question. How did Tojo manipulate the thoughts and actions of people? Convince everybody to follow Bushido. Convince everybody to follow the tradition of the samurai. Brainwash and militarize children from a young age. And anyone who resists this program of militarization can be kidnapped, can be arrested, and the Kempeitai can bring them to a place such as Unit 731, where they will be tortured and they will probably not come out alive. All right, that's our 4 rapid response summaries. The overall focus question for today is here. To what extent was Tojo as terrible as the other totalitarian leaders of the time? Remember, when the question says to what extent, it is asking how much. So how terrible was Tojo compared to Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin? There's a bonus video here if you want to watch that to understand the horrors of Unit 731 in greater detail. And tonight's reading is Tojo, Criminal or Statesman?